Okay, well, thank you for your attendance. Just a couple of little technical things. While the videos go, while the lecture is going on, we'd like you to stay mute, so there's no unwanted noise while everyone is speaking. The talk is going to be recorded. It's going to be shown later on the PRONI YouTube channel. So if you don't want to appear in the video, do make sure your camera is turned off as well. Otherwise, you may appear, a small little icon may appear. We're hoping at the end of the set of talks to have some questions and answers. So just put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. We hope to have about, say, 15-20 minutes at least to go through some questions. Now, just by way of introduction, PRONI is privileged and very glad to be associated with this groundbreaking exercise in the emancipation of material from the archives. Archives are, of course, I have to say this because I'm working in an archive, they're essential for the care and preservation of literary and historical documentation. But archivists are always concerned that papers in their custody find their way to the outside world. Otherwise, what's the point? And that doesn't mean just to the world of academia. You could say that archivists are jailers who want their prisoners, their charges, to be released, not to stay in a box under lock and key. Now, this is doubly important in the case of a creative and imaginative genius such as Brian Friel. The energizing idea behind this whole project was to show how Friel created his great plays, in the hope that this would stimulate creativity at every level in wider society, writing plays, poems, novels, whatever, but all kinds of other creativity. Paul and Connor have set up a digitization project, which is releasing over 3,000 images from the work in progress of Brian Friel in the 60s and 70s and 80s on open access online. Every step made and crossed out as the plays were shaped is there to be examined in these manuscripts. I think that the generosity and idealism of this project will have enormous benefits for our society. Now, I'm going to pass you on first to Paul, who's going to speak for about a half an hour on different aspects of the project. Then Connor will speak, and I'll talk briefly on the Tyrone Guthrie papers. I'll explain why at the time. We're going to have 20 minutes or half an hour for questions after the talks. So put your questions in the chat facility and we'll get there. So I'm passing over to Paul now. Thanks.
Thanks, Des. Hi, folks. So my name's Paul Murphy. I'm a senior lecturer in drama. I'm based at the Brian Friel Centre for Theatre Research at Queen's University, Belfast. I've been working at Queen's for nearly just over 20 years now. And I suppose I'm one of the founding members of the drama department. And it was very early days when I joined the drama department at Queen's. It barely got started, didn't even have a theatre. So we had a few things to do. And one of which was building the theatre in the first place. And then I was on a mission to get it called the Brian Friel Theatre. And it took a while, but the campaign was successful. And the Brian Friel Theatre was named and launched. And Brian himself came along, as did his family, as did Seamus Heaney, a lot of folks came along. And it was great. About the same time, I did sort of some deep dive archival research into Brian Friel's papers, you might say, which would include the letters he sent and received to friends and colleagues, and the early drafts of his plays, and crucially the notes concerning those drafts. And this was stored in the National Library of Ireland. I believe they were lodged there by Friel in 2000. So, like a good nerdy scholar, I took myself down there and started to work through them. And I thought they were fascinating. And then after a while, I started to get a bit sad because I thought, hold on, only middle-class nerds like myself get to look at these, incredibly informative and insightful documents, by which I mean, you can buy a copy of Brian Friel's plays, on Amazon or any other platform you want to get it on. You can have paper copy, you can buy a Kindle copy, but that's the finished product, isn't it? You know, that's the kind of canonical text. What is truly fascinating for me, and not just as a nerd and a scholar, but someone who is interested in engaging other people, particular people like myself, who come from working class backgrounds and who wouldn't, unlike my now middle class self, have access to the incredible resources of the National Library of Ireland or University Library. So I thought, how can I get this out to folks? Because those folks don't know about this place, don't know anything about maybe Friel's work, but they would find it interesting. They would find it useful, perhaps, especially if they had a notion that maybe they wanted to write or be some creative in somehow. Now, that's nearly 20 years ago, and the internet was still relatively new, and digital humanities was sort of in its infancy as compared to what it is now. I mean, these days, everything's digital, which is why the project was named, the project that Conor and I have been driving is called Friel Reimagined. And we're trying to reimagine Friel for the digital generation, which I suppose is all of us. I mean, what are we doing now? We're on a digital platform, aren't we? So I had to wait for the technology to catch up. So, and I had other things to do, of course, like teach at university and produce research and all the rest of it. But eventually the time was right, and I was fortunate to work with some great folks, especially Michaela Clark in Darrow at Queen's, who really helped me get the funding. And Deirdre Wildy, the head of special collections and archives at Queen's, who was magnificent in helping me negotiate and understand these issues called rights and bundled rights and copyrights. And once I had a certain amount in place, I approached Brian Friel and said, would it be okay if I did this? I said, sure, fire away. So I did. And after a while, we started to get the material together. And as I said, the main thrust of it was making the early drafts and notes of his plays available so that people could see how, for want of a better word, his masterpieces, his great plays were written. So we chose 5 of the most acclaimed plays, starting from Philadelphia, Here I Come, in the early 60s, all the way up to Dancing at Lughnasa, which I think is 1990. And you can see, literally, step by step, some of these plays start life literally on the back of a piece of paper, a brown piece of paper in some instances. And you see the very early sketchings and drafts of what the characters would be like and the dialogue. And it is absolutely fascinating. It's like, here's, you know, these how it's made videos you can see on mainstream media, but also in YouTube or wherever you like. This is better because it's the actual playwright himself taking you through this process, if you just care to read them. And that was the genesis of the idea, and which we brought together. Part of Friel Reimagined was also engaging what they would say in university speak as outreach or engaging communities who are, as I mentioned, either because of class or background or for one reason or another, wouldn't be able to engage with culture and art in the way that they could do. So we work with folks, residents of Hyde Bank Young Offenders Centre, Hyde Bank Women's Prison. We work with the Stronger Together Immigration Network, and we work with a school in North Belfast that's in, shall we say, an economically and socially challenged area. And we were stunned by how well folks took to it, you know, how much they found Friel's work interesting. And I think Friel's work is interesting in and of itself, as great plays obviously are. But for me, the real value of the project is for the plays, particularly the notes and how the plays are made, to serve as a creative catalyst to engage folks. I mean, you know, imagine a young boy who's had a tough life, is probably beaten by his parents. Alcohol is a problem in the family, drugs are a problem. Poor fellow ends up inside a Young Offenders Institute, written off by society, you might say. Imagine if that young boy happens to come across this work and is shown, you know, some of the rudimentary skills necessary so that he can stand up for the first time in his life in front of people, say his name, and then perform the role of, say, Private Gar from Philadelphia, Here I Come. That actually happened. And that's one amongst a number of folks with similar background, male and female, diverse faiths, all kinds of of backgrounds that, again, would be seen to be those people, those communities, rather than, real life flesh and blood people who just want to be given a chance. So that was a big part of the project, and something that I'm very keen to pursue as we develop the project. It might be worth explaining a little bit about Friel and why I focused on Friel's work over and above any other playwright. A thing to bear in mind first and foremost is Friel is, I say, perhaps only after Samuel Beckett, probably the most acclaimed playwright to have emerged from the island of Ireland in, let's say, the second half of the 20th century. His plays are on nearly every school syllabus. They're studied all around the world. It's funny, whenever I go into Japan at conferences, I've been to Brazil, I've been to the States, been in quite a few countries, and whenever you mention Brian Friel, everybody says, I love his work. I think it's fascinating. Whereas on this island, or particularly in the north, not so much. I think it's a case of perhaps no man of profit in his own land. But when people ask me, either folks in those countries or other academics or the students who have the privilege to teach, and they say, well, why is he so successful? How does this happen? How does a wee man from, West Tyrone become a giant of the world stage? And I think, based on nearly a quarter of a century, I've been studying the man's work in earnest. It's all about the small details. Now, that might seem like a cliche, but not really. His great inspiration was the great Russian dramatist Anton Chekhov, who practically invented what we understand as modern drama. Okay, Henrik Ibsen came before him and did incredible work, but really Chekhov set I wouldn't say template, but the style that we all have built upon. Every major playwright in the 20th century either has built upon it or reacted against it. And those, Friel scholars amongst us will know, of course, that Chekhov is the main influence upon Friel himself. And what do they have in common? Well, they're both from arguably provincial towns. Friel from just outside Omagh in Northern Ireland. Anton Chekhov from Taganrog, which is a arguably provincial part of Russia on the coast of the Sea of Azov, which is currently in a war zone in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. So they both focus on small-town provincial life. And what they focus on are the small details of you might call it the humdrum, the quotidian, the mundane. But it is precisely this focus on these small details of normal everyday life, which practically everybody around the world can relate to. I mean, Friel self-consciously names the sort of main sort of venue for his plays as this sort of make-believe town called Ballybeg or Ballybug, which translated from the Irish, of course, means small town or small place. And frankly, most of us, unless we happen to be, the Pope, the President, or the King of England, or some other celebrity, we all live, fairly small, humdrum lives, don't we, really? I suppose at the end of the day, even the President and the Pope and the King of England, when you really look at what they do in a day, a lot of it's quite, mundane. But the skill of Chekhov, the skill of Friel, is to make the mundane interesting and get you to take your time and ponder and pay attention to it and make it charming and interesting, or rather reveal how charming and interesting it is and how people cope with their daily lives. Philadelphia, Here I Come, for example, is the quintessential Irish situation of a young person, Gar, who has just had a sick and tired of the provincial nature of the small town of Ballybeg, and he wants to get out and go to America, as many of his generation did in the middle of the century, because not much is happening in small town provincial Ireland. And it's a classic case of the grass is greener, or as they would say in recovery circles, doing a geographical, because it's got to be better elsewhere than it is here. And the great thing is that Friel knew this, and Friel has always been, and I say this in the best sense, a very canny playwright. It wasn't just writing the play Philadelphia, Here I Come for an Irish-American audience, although he was a bit, but it was writing for a global audience. In other words, an audience that you could find nearly anywhere in the world. because often folks, wherever they are, have a sense that that life is better somewhere else. We all have our ups and downs, our hopes and fears. And whether you could resituate that play in China, you could resituate it in a country in Africa, you could put it in Russia. The audience would understand it, they would get it. And this is the strength of Friel's approach. He makes it so that folks can get it. With all due respect to Samuel Beckett, his plays, of course, are brilliant. He won a Nobel Prize. There's no dismissing the quality of the plays, but they're somewhat more abstract, arguably, than Friel. I think you can get Friel more quickly than you can with Beckett. The same with Shakespeare. You have to unpack Shakespeare's language. It's Renaissance English. His references, his literary allusions take time to unpack, you know, apart from the great monologues or the high moments of tragedy in King Lear or in Hamlet or Macbeth. But most of the time it's hard to follow the language. Not so with Friel. It's not to say the work is simple or even easy, but the way he crafts it, and he does craft it. If you look at how the scenes are constructed, for example, in his play Freedom of the City, which is a play really focused on civil rights, but it's set as a response, you might say, to the Bloody Sunday massacre, and how he very carefully selects and chooses every word to work in every particular scene in an incredibly complicated play, moving from sort of standard realism to playful sing-song to balladeers to the scene with a judge and a trial, to a soldier interrogating people. It would be a mess if it weren't handled properly. Friel has that level of skill that can make it work. The same can be said for a play like Translations, which is the next play of the 5 that we look at. Some would say his magnum opus or his masterpiece. And it's a play, well, it's a play about language, it's a play about identity. And the high point of the play, for those who haven't seen it, I'm not going to give much away, because me proud is one thing. You seeing a play on stage, of course, is quite another. But it was put on in the National Theatre in London a couple of years ago with Ciarán Hinds starring in it as the lead, you could argue. And the strength of the play is that it can travel across time and across geographical locations. It's ostensibly about the first ordnance survey of Ireland in the 1830s, before the onset of the Irish famine and the complete devastation that it wrought, combined with British colonial mismanagement on the Irish population, particularly the Irish-speaking population. But instead of it becoming locked in history as a play about that moment and that time in that country, what he does is he takes the issue of translation and the impossibility of us really being able to understand each other, and shows how possible it is to actually go beyond barriers of language, of culture, of power, to find a connection. And there's a great scene with Moira and Yolande where that takes place. And it's the relatability of that scene. You might call it hopeless romanticism or naivete, or you could say it's a triumph of the human spirit. You can take it any way you like, but one way or another, you'll get the sense that what Friel is trying to achieve in that particular play. And we found that works very well with audience, particularly younger people, who find that there's a whimsicalness, there's a playfulness that balances out the seriousness and the politics that is saturated with. After Translations, you have an incredibly powerful and complicated play called Faith Healer, which Friel really struggled with, because he spent a lot of time constructing this play that's basically 4 monologues, and it's not a very dramatic play in terms of there's not much movement in it. If drama, the original sense in the Greek word means drama means to do things or actions, it's just one character after another of the 3 characters standing and talking. And it died a death in its first production in the United States. It had the great James Mason, the sort of star of Hollywood's golden age, who persuaded his wife against her best wishes to star in this piece, and was directed by a great director, but the whole thing fell apart. They just couldn't make it work. And Friel was devastated, because this was meant to be a continuation of the success he had with Philadelphia, Here I Come. Didn't happen. However, decades later, the play has become the kind of play that great actors will take time out of, often making real money in big films, and take it on tour. For example, the great Ralph Fiennes, one of the cardinal actors of his generation, known to my son and his generation as Lord Voldemort in the Harry Potter films, just took this thing on tour, took it to Belfast, took it around the place. And it's become the kind of a play that the serious actor wants to show. It's almost like, powerlifting. I can do this play, I can lift this heavy weight, I can do faith healer and make these very challenging monologues work. So it's an interesting thing to look at Friel's career. That which was written off basically at the start, nearly wrote him off, came back and became one of the, and it's not just my opinion, of course. When I say words like masterpiece, these are the words that are used by theatre reviewers, by scholars, and by those who come and watch the plays, and directors and actors as well. The next play, and the final one I'll talk about, because I don't want to talk too long, is Dancing at Lughnasa, which is the play that really, I think, having spoken to members of Brian's family about this, that really catapulted Brian into the stratosphere of world attention, because a film was made of the play, starring Meryl Streep, and this really solidified the transition of Friel to sort of a globally recognized playwright. Although he'd been, hailed and acclaimed for many years, this was the piece that really launched him. And having Meryl Streep, who could have her pick of any film she wanted to do this at the peak of her powers, was a big deal. The play is about 5 women living in the Glen Tees in Donegal in the 1930s, and they face a very difficult situation, because Ireland at the time had independence had only been achieved a few years before the play set, and you have Eamon de Valera's government enacting laws that really start to shape women's lives at a very personal level, and you have sort of the worst excesses of state enshrined Catholicism, Irish style, which kind of overdetermined how women were expected to behave and think about their bodies, and notions of chastity and wedlock and having children outside of wedlock. And the play really gets to grips with this, and it's a very challenging play, although it's often seen as quite a whimsical piece, and it's known more famously for a dance sequence that takes place, which some scholars have a problem with. Others think it's a triumph, but nonetheless, it's Friel's homage, you might say, to his mum and his aunts and their generation, the women that had to live through that kind of Ireland, that has only, quite frankly, in recent years, in the popular imagination, been challenged. All the scandals that have emerged with the church and with the hierarchies in Ireland at that time, only starting to come out now, nearly a century after the fact. It's something that Friel wanted to get to grips with, but not in a dogmatic way. Unlike Bernard Shaw, who can be incredibly dogmatic, as he used to call his plays, a lecture in one sitting, Friel has a playfulness and an ingenuity and a wittiness that holds the attention of the audience, and it can get across some of the most serious themes you can imagine in a way that is engaging and even at times endearing. And I could go on at length at this, but I don't want to sort of do a half-baked version of Bernard Shaw and give you a lecture in one sitting. I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what the project is that Conor and I have been driving, and a little bit of a taster of the plays that we've engaged with and why we engage with them. And perhaps answer some of your questions at the end if you have any.
Thanks. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, all I'll just say is I'll pass you on. Thanks very much, Paul and Conor. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Des. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me okay. My name is Conor McCafferty. I'm the project and outreach manager for Friel Reimagined. So over the past 2 and a bit years, I've been working alongside Paul, our colleagues in special collections, especially Deirdre Wildy and Conor Kerr, and other colleagues from Queen's, different departments in the School of Arts, English and Languages, and other departments, and colleagues as well from the National Library of Ireland and from JSTOR, all in order to digitize and make accessible the archives of Brian Friel relating to 5 of his key plays. So the ones that Paul just mentioned there, Philadelphia, Here I Come, Faith Healer, The Freedom of the City, Translations, and Dancing at Lughnasa. I'll come back in a minute to talk a bit more about the whole process and what's actually in the archives. But to start, I thought it might be nice to actually hear from Brian Friel himself. So I've got a short video piece. This is from the RTE archives. Hopefully you're all seeing this okay. And I've hit share sound, so fingers crossed you'll actually be able to hear it too. This is a news item from 2001. It was covering a ceremony when to mark Friel's donation of his papers to the National Library in Dublin.
The collection of 70 boxes of papers constitute a complete archive, amounting to 380 files of documentation, short stories, radio scripts, and other works, including papers that chart the creation and fortunes of his short stories and 26 full-length plays.
We're able to add these to the collections we have of writers of previous generations, people like Shaw, Yeats, Joyce, and so on.
Arts Minister Sheila De Valera said the papers would enable scholars and literary historians to study the genesis of each of Brian Friel's works in detail.
It wasn't an easy decision to part with the papers, I must say that. But they had got to the stage when their needs were few but very specific. They wanted a good, dry home, they wanted some warmth, and they wanted a little attention. In fact, those are the very same things I need myself.
Among tonight's gathering was Frank McGuinness, who adapted Dancing at Lughnasa for the big screen.
What makes Friel powerful and great and wonderful is that he's true to himself, true to where he comes from, true to the parish he comes from, and true to the place he comes from.
I want to dance, kid.
Making the film here, actress Meryl Streep said this about Brian Friel's storytelling.
It's lovely. Reminiscence, very moving and sad and sweet.
Colin Connolly, RTE News.
Hopefully you could see and hear that okay. So that was, the RTE News coverage of Friel donating his papers to the National Library of Ireland. So in terms of what we've worked on is really quite a small portion. It's taken us quite a while, and it's a small portion, but it's actually quite substantial because it's a vast collection in total. I'm just going to show you a couple of things on screen, so bear with me. Just to give you a bit of context. So these are Brian Friel's plays. He actually wrote, they mentioned in the news piece there that he'd written 26 plays, I think. He continued writing after 2000 when he had donated his papers, and another tranche of his papers were donated to the National Library in, I think it was 2010, by his family. It covers his entire career. So even the short stories, he was quite an accomplished short story writer, being published in the New Yorker magazine, for example, the kind of renowned international literary magazine. And up until the 1960s, when he changed his focus to focus primarily on playwriting. And so these are his 1960s plays, your 8 plays in the 1960s. I've highlighted those that we've focused on in this project in yellow here. So Philadelphia, Here I Come from the 1960s. Really, as Paul mentioned before, his kind of breakthrough play with this kind of innovative use of a public and private persona on stage at once. In the 1970s, we've picked out The Freedom of the City and Faith Healer, but there are other, really wonderful plays in there as well that, deserve to be kind of seen online as well and accessed more widely. Translations, his kind of really his masterpiece from the early 1980s. And one of a string of plays that were all premiered at the Guildhall in Derry as part of his work with the Field Day Theatre Company. So all throughout the 80s, there was a strong connection there to the Guildhall. And we actually were lucky enough to be able to show our exhibition on Friel's papers at the Guildhall in Derry back in November. So it was amazing to be able to show Friel's draft works and his papers in the same building where some of these, really significant premieres would have happened. He continued writing through the 1990s and into the 2000s with a lot more adaptation work as well. So Paul had mentioned in his talk there about Friel's inspiration, Chekhov's inspiration on Friel and his kind of influence on Friel. There was also Turgenev, another Russian writer, and Macklin, who was a Donegal-based writer. But Friel had adapted several Chekhov plays, but he continued to write his own original plays as well, right up until 2008 was the Spinal Piece, which was an Ibsen adaptation of Hedda Gabler, but really, really well received and well-respected plays throughout his career. And just that kind of shows you just the sheer amount of output that he had. It was kind of staggering. And then through his donation of his papers to the National Library of Ireland, we not only have then the kind of finished scripts, we don't not only have performances and revivals which continue. The National Theatre in London, for example, just finished a run of a new production of Dancing at Lughnasa, which was again really well received. But it allows us to see Friel's work in progress in great detail. So I'll just show you now a couple of items that will hopefully give you a sense of what's actually in the archives. So this is from the National Library of Ireland. It's their kind of catalogue. You can find this on their website, the National Library of Ireland, nli.ie. But basically, you see, for example, this is their kind of table of contents, and it goes into great detail about what's in the papers. So there's Friel's fiction and articles, and then his plays, and it goes through all of these plays, and for each of them, it has, manuscripts. So this would be things like, Friel's handwritten notes to himself, as he's working on initial concepts and ideas. Might be draft pieces of dialogue. Oftentimes, it's Friel kind of questioning himself and questioning the kind of direction of the play. What is it that he's trying to do with this piece? Is it working? And he questioned himself in kind of great detail in order to strengthen his ideas, to kind of really sort of, work and kind of work through the ideas and make sure that they were working. So the manuscripts are really the core part that we have focused on in the 5 plays that we have digitized. So as you'll see, that all this material relating to all of these plays, Friel was absolutely meticulous and kept incredible records. Basically kept everything in that related to in any way to any of the plays, from the kind of background research and manuscripts that we've digitized, but also things like correspondence relating to the productions. So he might be in touch with theatre producers, with theatres, with actors, with agents and so on, to help put the plays together and to stage them. And then all sorts of correspondence with people who provide him with lots of information and background. So that could be researchers who might be working on, for example, for his play Making History, he made a big effort to get in touch with various different researchers on the Earl O'Neill, who's the subject of that play, who provided him with, loads of kind of photocopied research articles and all sorts of things like this. Friel would then mark up all these kind of pieces of research, and all that material, the kind of photocopied articles and things like that, with Friel's handwritten notes on top of it, and then his own notes that he's written separately, they all appear in the archives, and you can go and consult them at the National Library in Dublin. And then there's loads of other stuff about things like TV productions, the Field Day Theatre Company, lots of financial kind of background information and that kind of stuff. and yeah, loads and loads of correspondence. So it's an incredible, absolutely incredible resource that the National Library holds. But as I say, we have focused on really, to try and get to grips with this material, we've focused on 5 plays and really the kind of manuscripts. So the material that it's really about Friel's creative process that we were interested in. Obviously, the correspondence, all that stuff, you know, the kind of the staging of the plays, working with agents and actors and so forth, all's really, really interesting. But like for us, the key thing that we wanted to get across in this project was all about Friel's creative process, his work at the writing desk, in his office, in his home office in Donegal, you know. So in terms of the digitization, then I think digitized, you know, materials, it seems very straightforward. We're so used to having access to digitized resources. We absolutely take it for granted these days. There's a sort of ease and simplicity and immediacy and kind of connection, you know. We can all jump on to Google on our phones, on our laptops, and do a bit of research and try and find some interesting stuff. You know, we can get a list of Friel's plays, we can find out where they're showing and so on. And this has become so much more, you know, connected and widespread these days. But it's very easy to forget all the work that goes into digitization and, you know, how do you undertake a project like this in the first place? First of all, there's Friel's work as a writer, and all the work that he put into his plays. You know, it's years, it's decades worth of material that he has so carefully and scrupulously saved, and, you know, and then so generously really donated to the National Library as a resource for anyone really to explore. So we're all about broadening that access to his work, and hopefully enabling some new ways of interacting with it that you might not necessarily be able to do if you have to go and kind of consult the paper record in person at the library. There's other elements in terms of digitization rights, which Paul mentioned. So we've worked really closely with the Friel estate, who represent the family's wishes and Friel's kind of legacy in terms of what his wishes were. So we've been really, really grateful to have their support in this project, and I think it was absolutely essential to allow it to happen. The NLI were absolutely brilliant in terms of preparing, scanning, and taking care of the original documents. Again, quite a slow process, and we began it when we were still in the middle of lockdowns in terms of COVID. So even actually getting staff into the National Library reading rooms to be able to photograph and scan the papers was quite an undertaking. And then from the Queen's side, our special collections colleagues, archivists, did so much work in terms of cataloging the papers in great detail. So they'd get these batches of digitized papers sent up from Dublin, and then here at Queen's they'd work on cataloging the material in detail and making sure that what we had requested had come through. So there's a huge amount of work in terms of that kind of digitization process, but it all starts out with assessing the catalog, reviewing the papers, figuring out what we wanted to digitize, and going from there. The cataloging was, after the cataloging process was completed, it was all uploaded to Content DM, which is a system we use at Queen's. And just to give you a bit of a flavor of what's available on there, there are actually several, give me 2 seconds till I share this screen. There are multiple collections on this is the Queen's Digital Special Collections and Archives. So it uses this system called Content DM. So it's all sorts of stuff, mainly relating to kind of archival collections that have been donated to Queen's over the years. There's all sorts of diaries of people who'd gone on all sorts of travels internationally in the 19th century. There's music collections, photography collections. There's the Queen's Film Theatre brochure archive is all on there. So the Friel archive is actually then, we have our digitized version is on this system, but it's not actually accessible publicly, because instead, after we had put it on here, we've got it, this kind of is the backup version that's on the Queen's site, but our other partner in the project was JSTOR. So JSTOR, if you're not familiar with them, their main kind of focus is on sharing academic journals, kind of open access for people to consult, to kind of have access to high quality academic research. But they've also branched out into primary sources and providing access to that kind of material as well. And they're really keen on partnering with, academic institutions. So Queen's has a partnership now with JSTOR, and that is where our project, the Brian Friel Digital Archive, has been made accessible. So anyone now, anywhere in the world can, if you type in Brian Friel Digital Archive, that should be the first result. You might want to put in JSTOR in your Google search, or you can go to JSTOR's website, jstor.org, and search for the Brian Friel Digital Archive, and you'll find it there as well. And then you'll see that we've organized the 5 plays into each, they've each got its own little collection. And this is almost 3,000 items in total. So to give you a sense of like what kind of thing is in there, let's go to Philadelphia, Here I Come. So his kind of breakthrough play from the 1960s. There's a little introduction, very short introduction about the play and about the papers relating to the play. But Paul mentioned, that Friel would kind of write notes to himself on maybe it was the back of an envelope or just a piece of scrap paper. But this is a lovely little item from the archive. First notes on Philadelphia. So this is an envelope that was actually stuffed full of more and more handwritten notes. But he's written this, obviously something that was really important to him on the front. He says, there must be hearty, from the heart and belly laughter. And so number 1, there must be reactions of hearty laughter. And number 2, there must be sadness. People must cry for grief. So he's kind of, quite often you'll find in the papers that he writes kind of the big idea that he wants to get across in big letters on a piece of scrap paper. He'll often revisit it. And then sometimes you'll see again and again in the papers as well, he'll score out or cross through little items that he's already dealt with. His notes in Philadelphia are really, really interesting and kind of show his kind of dramatic, his theatrical sort of intelligence really, really developing and coming into its own. And there's another one that's kind of, this is again a piece that's sort of really big and bold. He's just like torn off this piece of scrap paper and written, everybody wants something, tries to state it, can't. And underneath that then he's got all the characters in Philadelphia, Here I Come. And so he lists out, what is it that each of these characters wants, but they just can't say, they can't find the words to say it. And then, of course, with GAR, public and private, GAR private is able to say it, and that causes huge hilarity, of course, among the audience, and also a really, really deeply felt sense of kind of almost tragedy towards the end of the play. But this is for you kind of thinking through, how do I make this work? There's loads and loads of just kind of in the National Library in Dublin, they're just kind of loose sheets. Sometimes they might be bound together by a little staple or a little piece of fabric. But he's just kind of working through day after day, trying to figure out what is this play about? Who is this character, GAR, public and private? this is a description of Gar's room. So it's got a bed, an old-fashioned crockery, wash hand basin, soap, towel, etc., his gramophone and records, and he makes a little note to himself to list them, so that even in the productions, there's Gar's a big fan of, I think it's Mendelssohn. So you'll see Mendelssohn records, on stage in his room. But this is Friel kind of thinking through in great detail who this character is, what his world is like. So yeah, I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail about all the papers, but I just wanted to give a wee bit of a flavor of what they're like and what you can kind of encounter when you go and explore the papers. You can go onto the JSTOR site, as I mentioned, and you can now access these and just work through them and have a look and pick out interesting things. You'll kind of see all sorts of different examples of how he makes notes to himself, scores them out, maybe because he's dealt with it or because he's moved on from the idea. But it means that we've got this record of his creative process from start to finish. Another way also that you can kind of get an insight into the creative process is through our work with various scholars who we invited to introduce the papers for our exhibition and also for our website. So this is our project website on the Queen's University site, and we've tried to add as much kind of engaging information and background material as we can, including a series of illustrated introductions to the 5 plays. So I'll just show you those briefly first of all. So an introduction to Philadelphia, Here I Come, with illustrations by Annaghmakerrig. So there you see Gar, public and private, and they're I think in one of the late scenes of the play, they're watching the plane fly overhead with the belching grey smoke going out into the sky. The Freedom of the City, illustrated by Lydia Hughes, and she's done loads of lovely pieces, including this kind of map of the city of Derry at the time, a sort of illustrated figurative map, obviously, but it gives you a sort of a sense of that kind of atmosphere of the time. Faith Healer, illustrated by Ashwin Chacko, and the kind of the sort of motif in Faith Healer of these place names that are kind of an incantation for these characters. He's kind of written them into the sea there in his piece, but there's loads of other illustrations you can see from each of them as well. And translations, beautiful illustrations by Dermot Flynn, of kind of really beautiful Donegal landscapes, and then Dancing at Lughnasa, illustrated by Aisling. Oh my God, I'm really sorry, I've forgotten Aisling's surname. Aisling Lindsay, Aisling Lindsay, an illustrator based in Belfast, with a much kind of more magical sort of illustrative style. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention the essays that we've had commissioned from several Friel scholars to introduce the papers. So this is a really good way to kind of get a sense of what's in each of the collections. Probably, believe it or not, maybe even better than me clicking on example papers on the JSTOR site. But yeah, we've got some wonderful essays. Kelly Matthews, who's writing at the moment on Friel's early career, she did a lovely essay on Philadelphia. Lisa Fitzpatrick, who's based at Ulster University, discusses the kind of civil rights background to the Freedom of the City. That's a lovely essay as well. David Grant at Queen's goes into some detail on the kind of how Faith Healer developed over several years. That was quite a slow gestation of a play. And he kind of finds these kind of interesting little moments in the papers where Friel has insight or flashes of kind of, kind of discovery that enable him to move the play forward. A lovely piece from Alison Garden on the relationship between Moira and Yolland in translations, and the sort of mixed marriage idea, which is central to her research. She kind of explores how this comes through in translations, and it's been a kind of perennial idea in Irish literature and culture. And then the kitchen ceilidh scene, explored by Dr. Bernadette Sweeney as well, from Dancing at Lughnasa. So that's kind of a deep dive on one specific scene in a play. So those are a really good way to kind of get to grips with what's in the collection, and then, oh, I accidentally hit print there, sorry. And then to kind of, from there to kind of start your own exploration of the papers. So I'll stop sharing there. But if anyone would like any kind of, if anyone has any questions about what's in the papers, or would like any pointers of where to start or what to look at, we'd be very, very happy to help with that if we can. And finally, I just wanted to note that, through this whole project, we've also worked, as Paul mentioned, with community groups, with schools, with young people in a summer school we had last summer, for example, with people who are newly arrived in Northern Ireland as refugees, for example. And the amazing thing is that all of them have really, really resonated with Friel's work, and found it really inspiring and interesting and engaging, and a way to think about their own situations and their own lives, and to whether it's just for escape or for a chance to reflect on things that are important to them. And we've had an amazing experience working with Bruiser Theatre Company, going out to all sorts of different organizations and schools and community groups across Northern Ireland. And our work with them has been really foundational, and we really hope to be able to pursue that further in future. And we also love, as I mentioned, it seems like it's around 3,000 pages worth of material, which is loads to dig into that we have digitized, but we've barely scratched the surface of what's in the Friel papers, and we'd love to do more of this. So fingers crossed, in future we'll be able to continue the process, to continue the digitization, and just as importantly, to continue getting Friel's work out there to new audiences. I hope that was helpful, and please do feel free to ask any questions that you might have. Thanks.
Okay, I'll speak now. I'm going to share a screen. Thanks very much, Connor. I'll talk now a little bit about Tyrone Guthrie and the Guthrie papers that we hold in Public Record Office. My name is Des McCabe, and I'm an archivist in the Public Record Office. As I say, we're privileged to have this project available to us, and we've got an exhibition beginning in a couple of months in PRONI. You might be wondering why the Tyrone Guthrie papers. What's the connection with Friel? Well, Guthrie, I didn't know much myself about Guthrie. I'd heard about Annaghmakerrig. Annaghmakerrig is a very famous, it's probably famous worldwide at this stage, but it was the home of Tyrone Guthrie, and it is now a kind of a retreat or haven for writers, for dancers, for musicians. It provides a kind of a haven for creative work. And that's really what I knew. I knew about Friel, I knew about Annaghmakerrig. I didn't know that much about Guthrie. You'll have seen in one of the papers that that is on the JSTOR file that Connor drew attention to, that Tyrone Guthrie was involved with Friel around the early 1960s. He is of Irish origin, largely of Irish origin, although he described himself as a very Irish kind of Anglo-Scot. So he's a mixture. He's Ulster Scot, he's Irish. His mother came from Monaghan, from Annaghmakerrig, which is a house near Newbliss in North County Monaghan, not far from the border. His principal importance in terms of Friel is that, well, I'm not sure how, I'd be very interested to read that there is an essay on this, on his connection to Friel, which I didn't get around to reading. I didn't know about, but I've sort of absorbed it myself, and I think he gave a kind of creative courage to Friel. Friel in the late 1950s was producing radio plays, he was writing short stories. He set out to be a writer really about 1960, and he gave up teaching gave up maths teaching. And he was thinking strongly of being the playwright that he became. But he was moving from short stories, which is very personal and you could say almost like private creative world, to plays. And plays are a strange mixture of the public and personal. So they involve ideas, and they involve human understanding, and the real people and the presentation of people on stage. Friel had loads of ideas, but he did need a certain kind of direction, I think. And certainly Guthrie gave him a great deal of support and guidance in the early 1960s, crucially in the making of Philadelphia, Here I Come. And he served as a kind of mentor for Friel for the next, until Guthrie died in 1971. And so for about 10 years, he served as a very important mentor for Brian Friel. He gave constructive criticism. He was a trustworthy sounding board for Friel at a time when Friel was expanding his creative repertoire and really developing the kind of groundbreaking techniques that he developed in the 60s and 70s. Who was Guthrie? Now my my slideshow isn't working perfectly, so I'm going to have to go through it like this. Guthrie was born in England of an Irish mother and a Scottish father. He was deeply attached to his mother's home in Annaghmakerrig, and he ultimately settled there in the 1960s. He inherited it in the 1950s and lived there for the last 12 years of his life. He was probably the most important theatre director in the English-speaking world in the 20th century. He was certainly one in the early 20th century. He was very, very important. A little bit like Friel, as Paul said, he, although he had very strong connections with Ulster, he's perhaps not given the kind of credit that he deserves in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, or in Ireland as a whole. There's a little summary there. He was absolutely brilliant, but he had to have his own way. A perverse, complicated, brilliant, and extraordinary man. At times, he had to stand up and fight for your life, or he would swamp you. This is by somebody, Anthony Quayle, a very well-known actor, who loved him as a person. It sounds, you can see there, he's quite a formidable-looking guy. He was very tall, which is part of his physical charisma. He was extraordinarily brilliant, and he had a great sense of immediacy as a director. So we're sharing our archive. We've had this archive for the last 30 years in PRONI, and it's been used to a certain extent, but not very much. There's a lot more that can be done with it. And I think anybody interested in Friel was a brilliant playwright. His mentor Guthrie was a brilliant director. And it's probably fair to say that because it's very public art, the writer can just write a short story, and once he gets it published, he's completely in charge of it. The playwright needs actors, needs an audience, a physical audience, and needs a good director. You just can't escape that. So as a director and as a mentor, he is very important to understanding Friel too. Now I'll go through. This is the he came from his family came from Annaghmakerrig. He identified with Annaghmakerrig, although he was born in Tunbridge Wells in England. His mother was Nora Power from Annaghmakerrig. He had a fascinating background because he was distantly related to the Hollywood actor Tyrone Power, and through his grandfather William James Power, he was related to Tyrone Power, the fairly significant actor born in Waterford and died in 1841. And he played in a lot of Charles Lever plays in the 1830s. Now, as an historian, I tend to feel almost instinctively that you will learn a lot about yourself from your past, from your ancestry. And I think there is something to be learned from about Tyrone Guthrie's person from his ancestry. So the fact that he had theatrical background is not insignificant. Annaghmakerrig was originally known as Leysborough, and the Moorhead family owned Annaghmakerrig, or owned Leysborough, from the 1700s. This is a quick family tree. Dr. John Moorhead, a medical doctor of Leysborough, Annaghmakerrig, married Susan Humphreys and had a daughter, Martha. Sir William James Tyrone Power married Martha about 1850. He had a career in the British Army as a commissar, and his daughter Nora married Dr. Thomas Guthrie in about 1895, and Tyrone Guthrie was one of their two children. And then Tyrone Guthrie lived from 1900 to 1971, and he described himself as an Irish kind of Anglo-Scot. Now, very quickly, the structure of the archive. There's the papers of Dr. John Moorhead. Now, in a way, the Annaghmakerrig estate, Tyrone Guthrie, most of what Friel did was a matter of personal understanding and social understanding. I mean, it was historical, political, and social. Paul mentions both Beckett and Friel as the most profound Irish playwrights of the second half of the 20th century. They were very different. Beckett really discussed social isolation. Friel looked at the disordered relationship between society and the person, and Irish society and the Irish person, in a sense. But by looking at it in great particularity, he made it universal. But he in a sense felt that you could look at society and the person in society in a way that Beckett, in a sense, almost took social alienation as a premise. Tyrone Guthrie belonged to the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, a small landed gentry family, and the estate, so that our archive connects. If you want to kind of look at it in this way, I think you can see it connecting with. There's a great deal in it that will illuminate the concerns of Brian Friel in understanding Irish society historically, and so essentially the kind of society that Friel was trying to figure out, and how people are placed in Irish society, the constraints and the repressions. So the Annaghmakerrig archive, what we've got is, we've basically got personal correspondence. We've got the papers of Sir William Power, that's B, which a great deal is concerned with his military career, which is again fascinating. Power himself was a man of great, he was very skeptical about the land system and the damage done by the land system. He was a home ruler by the 1870s, but he had a very uncomplicated relationship to the imperial project, and he would have seen himself as he would have seen the place of Ireland as a a natural part of the British Empire. He wouldn't have any problem with that. And so a lot of what he's got is fascinating. As a commissar, he was basically working as a commissar. That's the supply side of the British Army. So wherever there was army activity, he had to supply food and ammunition and everything else to the army, and that meant that he traveled all over the place, all over the British Empire during the between about the 1830s and the 1870s. And we've got fantastic snapshots through his correspondence and his papers of the activities of the British Army in all around the world. He also has some fascinating diaries where he's back in Ireland and he's discussing the local area. And the next thing we've got a lot of stuff relating to, we've got the personal papers of William and Martha Power, correspondence, and that goes right up to correspondence with Tyrone Guthrie himself. Then we've got estate papers specifically, right up to the land purchase papers in the 1890s. And again, remember, this is the background of an awful lot of what Friel was concerned with in recreating the fracturing and the divisions and the damage to people caused by Irish history, you could say. And I mean, a big part of that is the colonial project and the land system, you know, which is a system of power and abuse of power. So it's very interesting that in the end, by the early 1960s, it was a product of this system of power who supported him, and he admits himself, gave him the courage to go forward with the groundbreaking plays of the 1960s and 70s. We've got the estate papers there. We've got miscellaneous papers of the Power and the Guthrie family, which includes a lot of sketchbooks and things. And we've got photograph albums, and we've got further estate, like we've got, and then we've got a great deal of stuff specifically relating to Tyrone Guthrie himself and his work as a director. You can see there plays, poems, prose and scripts, notes and productions, creative work by Judith Guthrie and her correspondence, photograph albums and folders, tours in Finland, Canada, wartime Britain, work in Belfast, the Old Vic in London, the 1930s to the 50s, Shakespeare productions, work in Stratford, Ontario, and in the Guthrie Theatre in Minneapolis, that's from 54 to 63, and then portraits of Tyrone Guthrie, correspondence to and from Tyrone Guthrie, and theatre programs, address books, contracts, diaries. All of this, essentially, when Friel wanted to become a playwright, a fully fledged playwright, he had done radio plays, but to kind of go right into theatre, he went to Guthrie he went to the Guthrie Theatre in Minneapolis, and he spent time with Guthrie. He was deeply impressed by Guthrie, and he basically knew that he felt he needed to learn a great deal from Guthrie. So a great deal of the stuff here is relevant to Friel. Now, works on Guthrie that have been produced, there's been Guthrie died in 1971. He commissioned a biography himself before he died from James Forsyth. That's been done. There's a wonderful series of memoirs, interviews and reminiscences by Alfred Rossi. And then Christopher Fitzsimon produced the letters of Tyrone Guthrie, a selection of the letters several years ago. That dips into some of the PRONI archive, but it mainly relies on the letters of Tyrone Guthrie kept by his sister and passed on to his granddaughter, held in England. We've still got a great deal that can add to that. Now, I'm going to just start with, I'm going to give you just a quick, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just to give you a flavor of the archive, I'm going to just show you some images. The archive goes from about 2016 to the 1970s. And the earliest documents are beautiful surveys of the estate at Annaghmakerrig. And, well, these are the kind of things that Friel was thinking about when he was writing translations, for instance. Essentially, these are the between the 1700s and the late 1820s, maps were produced by the estate surveyors. It was only in 1829, 1830 that the Ordnance Survey began to produce maps. But of course, in order to produce maps, the same kind of translation work had to be done. And so before the state did these translations, local surveyors and estate agents were doing the translations. And if you look at these maps, you get it. This is a map of 1816. It's only just 10 years before translations, and it's of the Annaghmakerrig estate. And here's just a blow up of it. You can see there of the Annaghmakerrig estate was a small estate, about 7 or 8 townlands, and that's a little picture of the mansion. So it's really quite nice. So he kind of starts with these kind of estate papers. Now, Power himself, as I say, Tyrone Guthrie had a certain ancestry, and that William Power, although he worked in the military for most of his life, he started as a man deeply interested in plays. And he wrote a couple of plays, and we've got those plays in the archives, in these Guthrie archives. He wrote a couple of plays in the 1840s, and he did a lot of stage production. And you could say that there was a connection between logistics and stage production, you know. So here's a couple of examples. This is a nice little thing, 1840, a little self-portrait with a few other sketches, and they're going to look very close, very like some other things. You can see in these images, they're essentially stage props. He was designing stage props, and that he did a lot of traveling, and in fact he did some very important anthropological works which were published on Australia and New Zealand. But William Power did, Tyrone Guthrie's grandfather. And to the right there, you see a pilot on the Nile. So he did a lot of that kind of thing. And here's a little image from his travels in Wales. This is Tyrone Guthrie's. This is from a commonplace book by Tyrone Guthrie's grandmother. And she copied poetry. This is Tennyson, Break, Break, Break. On thy cold grey stones, O sea. So it's just a quotation from Tennyson. It's a commonplace book from the 1840s as well. This is part of the background, the ancestral background. This is part of a diary of William Power's, where he's in Ireland, he's traveling in Monaghan in 1849. And he's commenting on the peasantry, essentially, and it's right in the middle of a still very grave crisis, subsistence crisis. It's the middle of the famine, really, and the famine had not ended. And but it's talking about life and death, peasant life and death, from the point of view of a sympathetic landlord in 1849. Now, we've got a huge range then of photos. I just kind of like scout through. This is Tyrone Guthrie and his sister Peggy as a young boy in Tunbridge Wells. This is the school that Guthrie went to. This is Guthrie as a very young man, just qualified from Oxford. And this is Guthrie in 1924 in BBC Belfast. Now, Guthrie is known for revolutionizing the way classic plays were presented on stage. He took plays and he reconstructed them to open them up. He wasn't interested in just, say, doing this for effect. He was interested in sort of breaking down the conventions of production so that people could get a strong feeling for the play. It may be, I mean, he was involved in the early 1920s in the new medium of radio, really. And that may be the source for actually, he had a new medium, so that may have actually inspired him to see plays differently, having to present them on a brand new medium. These are photos from I've got several photos from Guthrie was involved in wartime productions during the Second World War, 1940 to 1945 in England, to boost morale. That was kind of like seen as a very important part of the kind of home service. And these are just photos from that. And here's a whole load of notes, just like the Friel notes. We have a huge number of notebooks showing how he developed his stagecraft. This is traveling around Britain during the Second World War. These are the actors staying at different places in different towns. Here's the plays, the people setting up the plays. Again, you can't have a play. You can have a poem, you can have a short story without much reference to anyone else. You can't have a play without a lot of people and without getting people together and getting them to work together according to a unitary vision, which is a huge jump from writing a short story. So these are photos of people doing that. And this is Tyrone Guthrie as a director. Now, Tyrone Guthrie didn't really write plays. He wrote a few plays and he wrote a lot of talks, but he didn't have that creative power that, say, Friel had. But he was an extraordinary, charismatic and brilliant and creative director. And here's just a little, one of the productions that he produced. Here's the kind of, again, the Guthrie notebooks, where he kind of did little designs for costumes, and he did notes on how, on the stage furniture, all the different aspects of a play, all very, very important. You know, the play won't work without the right kind of stage furniture. Here's Guthrie, a more modern photo. This is about 1960, and it's just before he meets Brian Friel. But Brian Friel would have been acutely aware of him, and that's why he wanted to get to know him. He was inspired by Guthrie and inspired by the way he did things, and he wanted to do things that way. Now, here's a quick, again, the same guy says, Guthrie, when he was dealing with a play, when he was directing a play, he came with no static, preconceived idea. He had a general idea of what it should be, and the rest of it was immediate, hand to mouth, like a glass blower. Now, what he means is, once you decide, you can't stop in the middle of blowing a glass and creating a piece of glasswork and change your mind. You've got to just go for it. And that's the way Guthrie dealt with plays. He had a powerful intellectual vision, but it had great physicality. And that's one of the things that was very important to Friel. Connor pointed out a note that Friel made about that there had to be hearty laughter and people had to cry. I think it's arguable that some of that importance, the importance of physicality, came or was supported very importantly by Tyrone Guthrie and by the Guthrie stage, by the Guthrie stagecraft. It was both intellectual and physical. You couldn't have one without the other. It had to move people, but it had to make sense. And that's what Friel relied on. It had to startle people, but not just for pointless effect. So here's I think one of the final photos. These are a bunch of Guthrie came back to live in Annaghmakerrig in 1959, but he did a huge amount of work still supporting people. You could see him in the middle of that photo, standing head and shoulders above everybody else. His height came from his Scottish side. They were all very, very tall, and you can see how he was extraordinarily tall. And then finally, this is him standing in front at the stairs of Annaghmakerrig House. He's standing at the bottom of the steps and he's still level with everybody else. And it was very important to him that he turn Annaghmakerrig into a haven for creative writing. So these are our papers. So I'm going to stop now and we can go into questions and answers, and we might be able to continue a little bit. Let's see now. So, okay.